Hello, and thank you very much for joining me today for today's webinar presentation. As I have said a couple of times, you might have noticed in some of the commentary essentially related to the webinar, it's sort of not a presentation at all because we'll be focused instead today on answering questions directly from all of you. I did offer the opportunity to submit questions in advance, and a few photographers have taken advantage of that, so I have a group of questions already queued up. I'll try to get through as many of these, hopefully all of the questions. I know there's some questions showing up now. There is a Q&A down at the bottom. You should see Q&A down at the bottom of your screen, and so you can click that and submit a question in the Q&A pop-up. And again, I'll address as many of those as I am able to, all related to today, Lightroom. So using Lightroom to organize, optimize, and share your photos. And more than a few photographers have had some questions along the way. So let's go ahead and dive right in and start addressing some of those questions. And I should note, by the way, in the context of Lightroom, I know most of my readers are using Lightroom Classic CC, what used to be just called Lightroom, essentially, at what we knew as Lightroom in any event. And now with the new Lightroom CC, the cloud-based synchronization, that has changed things a little bit in terms of the nomenclature. As I mentioned, I'm assuming that most of my readers are using Lightroom Classic. I know that a few of you have made the switch to Lightroom CC or testing it out in any event. And so I will address some questions related to Lightroom CC. I imagine most of this will relate to Lightroom Classic, as it were. So the first question actually does relate to Lightroom CC, although in the context of mobile, not necessarily using it via the desktop application. So remember that Lightroom CC, the new Lightroom CC, is essentially an ecosystem. So there is a desktop application, there's also a mobile application, and you can access Lightroom CC essentially, in a manner of speaking, through the web browser. And so the question is whether Lightroom CC on a mobile device will create and retain history states that travel with the image, meaning if you work on the image later, if you work on an image on Lightroom CC on a mobile device when you're offline and then you later synchronize, for example, will Lightroom Classic be updated to reflect those changes? And more to the point, will there be a history there? And the answer is mixed. There will be a change to the image. So, for example, I have somewhere in here, where do I have? I have a collection, actually, that contains some images from Lightroom Mobile. And so here is an image that I updated via the mobile device. And it did change, as you can see. Well, you wouldn't know what the original looked like necessarily, but you can imagine that it was in color. It was converted to black and white on a mobile device. I happen to be using Lightroom CC on an iPhone and changed the appearance of the image. When we go to the Develop module, what you'll see in the History section is that there isn't a true history from Lightroom Mobile. There's just a reference to the fact that the image was changed via Lightroom Mobile. And so we don't have that full history, a full record of all of the adjustments that had been applied via Lightroom Mobile, unfortunately. We just have the net result reflected, so we can actually see the change in the image, of course. It will synchronize across all of our devices, but we don't get a full history. All right. Good question here. So I've mentioned previously that pick flags or reject flags are not included in metadata when you transfer over to another editing program. So for example, if I assign pick flags to an image, I'll go ahead and assign a pick flag to this image, for example, by pressing the letter P on the keyboard. You can see the little flag icon down at the bottom of the screen here on the film strip. At the top left corner, you see a little flag icon indicating that a pick flag has been assigned to the image. Even if I save metadata out to the actual image files, that pick flag is not visible to other applications. So for example, Adobe Bridge does not support the pick and reject flag tool, the attributes. It's not a metadata standard, and that's why I don't really recommend using pick and reject flags, because they're not really portable. They're not going to migrate to other software if you should stop using Lightroom, for example, at some point down the road. And so then what would you do in order to make a change? So if you've decided to change your workflow, and I talked about this in the previous webinar, where we talked about organizational guidelines, essentially, my recommendations for good organizational habits, and this notion of not being afraid of change because you can always go back and change your workflow. So let's say, for example, you've been using pick flags. Now you decide maybe that's not such a good idea. You want to start using star ratings instead. Well, moving forward, you can start using star ratings, but then how do you deal with this sort of archive, if you will, of pick and reject flags that are in your library? And the same concept could apply to a wide variety of different metadata. And the same basic concept applies in terms of how you would go about fixing that. So in the library module, over on the left panel, you'll find the catalog section, and we want to choose the all photographs collection, at least presumably, because you want to make this change across your entire Lightroom catalog. And so what I'm going to do then is filter the images based on whatever it is that I'm trying to change. So in this case, I want to search based on pick flags, for example, and I could just assign a filter. So I could go into attributes, for example, and choose that I want to filter based on having a pick flag. I'll take off the star rating option there. And actually, you can see a few other images that also previously had pick flags assigned to them. So by going to all photographs, filtering based on whatever that criteria might be, in this case a pick flag, I can then select all, so Control A on Windows or Command A on Macintosh, to select all of the current images and then just change the attribute essentially. So make sure first that you're in the grid view. If you were in the loop view, as far as Lightroom is concerned, you're working on a single image, and so if you make a change via a keyboard shortcut, for example, you will not be changing the attribute for all of the selected images, even though they're all selected. You could see that on the film strip. Instead, you need to be in the grid view. So while I'm in the grid view, I could change the attribute or assign a new attribute. So for example, I could press the number 1 on the keyboard to assign a 1-star rating if I'm treating that as sort of my replacement for the pick flag. And I generally recommend once you've done that you remove the pick flag. So I could press the letter U on the keyboard, for example, to unpick, to remove the flag altogether. All right, so then Nancy asks, let's see here, the majority of her Lightroom photos are organized in folders on an external hard drive, which is backed up. Very good. However, when she first started learning Lightroom, she put a few folders on the Mac desktop, and those are all imported from that location, and she wants to move them. So how do you go about actually moving? Actually, it's incredibly easy with perhaps a couple of minor caveats. So in this case, I do have some photos that are on a different hard drive. So in Nancy's case, it happens to be the desktop, which would be on your internal hard drive. But the point being is that you can see I have some photos on an internal hard drive and the majority of the photos on an external hard drive. Well, first of all, I suppose I should reiterate that in the context of Lightroom, we want to make sure that every task we perform related to our images is initiated inside of Lightroom. So of course, I'm going to do this move inside of Lightroom. Theoretically, it would be possible to do it outside of Lightroom and then reconnect the missing folder that would result, but I'd rather not have to worry about that. I'd rather just move inside of Lightroom. Keep in mind, of course, that there's at least a tiny bit of risk involved in moving photos from one location to another. In other words, the more conservative approach would be to copy the photos and then delete the originals. In the context of Lightroom, we're not able to actually copy photos. Our only option really is to move photos. And so I would want to take advantage of that option, but keeping in mind, of course, that I'll want to make sure that I have a really good backup of my system first. So as long as you're up to date on your backups, then there's really not much of a risk involved here. And frankly, there's not much of a risk to begin with. The other challenge with moving photos from one hard drive to another is that it would appear that Lightroom does not enable you to move photos across hard drives. So if I move, drag, and try to drop onto the My Photos drive, Lightroom does not allow me. And my only other option is to drag and drop onto another folder, and that is most certainly not what I want to do. The issue here is that I essentially can't see what's called the root level of the hard drive, that top level of the hard drive itself, the level where all of these other folders are actually stored. But I can reveal that at any time. I can simply right-click on any of my top-level folders. So I don't want to view the Austria 2012 folder here, for example. I would want the folder above it if there were any subfolders in the structure. And so I would right-click on any of those top-level folders and then choose the option to show parent folder. In this case, since we're talking about my hard drive, the folders down below are stored directly on the hard drive, you might say. What I'm revealing is not exactly a folder, but rather the hard drive itself. So now I could I'll move the titles slides here instead of the Instagram share folder, because that's a folder that I actually use. But I will drag the titles down to my photos. When I release the mouse button, Lightroom will ask for a confirmation. I'll go ahead and click move, and those images then get moved. So if I scroll down, I can go find those title images in a folder on the hard drive itself. And of course, if I'd like to, I can then hide that parent again, because I don't really need access to that top level on the hard drive. So I can just right click and then choose hide this parent. All right, so Vernon asks, he says, I have way too many keywords in my catalog, but they are all essential. Is there some way to search for the one I want instead of scrolling through them? Yes, there is indeed. First, I probably don't have all that many keywords assigned to this sample catalog. Let me go to my keyword list, and you'll see that I have some keywords in any event. A reasonably long list, and maybe not as many as Vernon has accumulated in his Lightroom catalog, but I can absolutely search. What I know a lot of photographers have missed is that we have this search field up at the top of the keyword list on the right panel in the library module. I can also expand and filter based on only the people keywords if you've used the people view, where we can tag the people who appear in our photos. But more importantly, I suppose, in this context at least, I can start typing letters, HV for example, and I get Havar. Or if I type, the letter B, then I get any keyword that includes the letter B. If I type BA, any keyword that includes those letters, etc. So I can just type to get to the specific keyword or keywords that I'm looking for. So I don't know if I have eagle. Yes, I do. I have bald eagle. If I also had golden eagle and maybe a couple other types of eagles, then I would see all of those keywords. And I could even assign right here by turning on the checkbox for the selected image. So you do have that ability to filter the keywords, essentially performing a search right within the keyword field, as it were, the keyword list. So Claire asks about adding essentially copyright and name information to a photo. And this is a question that I get a lot, I suppose with good reason. Photographers want to protect their images, especially if they're sharing them. One of the things to keep in mind with Lightroom is that, number one, it is non-destructive. So we're not able to alter the pixels in our image directly, so to speak. Instead, we're essentially applying metadata updates that'll be saved possibly in the image, depending on the image file format, certainly in the Lightroom catalog, possibly in a sidecar file. And so because of that overall construct, we're not actually able to change the visual appearance, as it were, right inside of Lightroom as it relates to that watermark. What that means is that we would need to watermark in some other way. And so let's assume I want to export this image. I could export. I could also share in the book, slideshow, print, or web modules. But let's assume that I'm going to export for some purpose. I'll use my Instagram share preset in my export settings here. And I can adjust all of the various settings. So I could rename the image, etc. And what you'll find is a watermarking section. So the watermark is how we can add that information when we're sharing an image, either exporting or printing or some other method of sharing. I can just turn on that check mark, the watermark check mark, and then the pop-up to the right will be available where I can pick and choose or create my own watermark. So you'll see a simple copyright watermark is the default here. I can go to Edit Watermarks, and that will bring up the Edit Watermark, the Watermark Editor dialog. And so I can put a copyright symbol and my name, for example. You can see it's currently in the bottom left corner. I can adjust all of these various settings for the image, so the position, the size, etc. And I can also, of course, change the text if I wanted it to say something else. Maybe you don't want the copyright symbol. If you do want the copyright symbol, by the way, on Macintosh, that would be Option G on the keyboard. So hold the Option key and press the letter G. The way I think of that is the capital G looks most similar to the copyright symbol. On Windows, handy keyboard shortcut that maybe no one will ever remember, and I don't know why I've remembered it all these years, but if you hold the Alt key and then on the numeric keypad type 0169, that will give you the copyright symbol. And so I could change the settings here. I could save. I'll just cancel in this case. I have actually my Tim Gray. I don't even remember what that one looks like. Maybe it just has my name. Yes, with a font and whatnot. But point being is that we can apply that watermark. So then when the image is exported, it will include the watermark. In this case, for example, creating a JPEG copy of the image. All right, so Dennis asks, he says, I've been converting RAW files, proprietary RAW files, you might say, RAW captures, to the Adobe Digital Negative or DNG file format for years as Lightroom imports the photos. I am now becoming concerned that if I sometime in the future decide to switch to another editing program, I may have a problem. I never thought I would consider switching. Should I be concerned? And I would say, by and large, no. There's no real reason to be concerned. The original capture data, essentially, meaning the actual pixel values, will be included in that DNG file. You will lose some of what are generally referred to as maker notes. That would be, you might say, private metadata that the camera includes. And so just as one example, Canon has that dual pixel technology, and you can make adjustments to the image after the fact. And that is not preserved in the case of converting the DNG, for example. So you're missing out on some of the, you might say, secret features of the proprietary RAW capture formats. Those features are only accessible using the software from the camera manufacturer. So for example, Lightroom doesn't have access to that information in any event. So that would be the only issue. And, quite frankly, I don't consider that in most cases to be a major issue, especially if you're a Lightroom user already. You've sort of gone without those specialty features, as it were. And then David asks, have you seen where Lightroom loses the photos in the catalog and displays 0 files in the folder? Can the files be re-imported to correct for that? And I would say, no, I don't believe I have ever seen that, at least not on purpose. Meaning that if there are 0 images in a particular folder, as is the case with this folder, there's usually a good reason. So for example here, thankfully, the reason is that I never added any photos to that folder. That folder is a parent that contains some child folders, you might say. So I've got an Austria folder and then different Austria folders from different trips, and that's just to consolidate those multiple folders. And so then the question is, if there really were images at one time in this Austria folder, how would they have gone missing? I would suggest very gently, very delicately, that if photos go missing from a folder in Lightroom, it's because they got deleted. They got removed. And so if I go into a folder and select all of the images in that folder, I can right-click and remove photos. And if this is how the situation unfolded, hopefully you chose the remove option and not the delete from disk option. If you remove, those images are only removed from the Lightroom catalog. Of course, we want to get those images back. How do I do that? The best way, the way I would recommend, is to synchronize the folder in question. So if we right-click on the folder, then we can choose the Synchronize Folder option from the pop-up menu. Lightroom will go out there and figure out what images are missing. In other words, which photos in that folder are not currently in the catalog. It can also scan for metadata updates. So maybe there were no photos missing, but you had some changes to metadata, and we can synchronize all of that. And so once that process completes, then you'll see that I've got all of my images right back where they were. This is a good reason, by the way, that I recommend saving metadata out to the actual image files so that you'll preserve that metadata regardless of what else happens. So a question about exporting to the iPad. So the question is specifically as it relates to Lightroom 5. So how do you get photos onto an iPad if you're using Lightroom CC or Lightroom Classic CC, I suppose I should say, or Lightroom CC, either of those versions? You can, of course, synchronize images. In Lightroom Classic, the way we synchronize is via collections. And so, for example, you can see that I have a collection of photos, and to the left there's this little lightning bolt symbol, and that means this folder is synchronized. And so I can then go to Lightroom on my mobile device. So I have the Lightroom CC app on my iPhone, on my iPad, on an Android device, etc. Then I can just pull up the app and I'll be able to see this collection. But the question in this case specifically related to Lightroom 5. What I recommend doing is essentially exporting to a folder that is in your Pictures folder, and then you can use iTunes to synchronize the images. And so I don't have an iPhone or an iPad plugged into my computer at the moment, so I can't show you that actual process in iTunes. But what I would do is just export photos and, for example, export into I would choose the Pictures folder from the primary destination up at the top, put into a folder, in this case, Instagram share, for example, choose what other settings. So I'd use a JPEG, maybe a couple thousand pixels long, maybe you want to assign a watermark, etc. And then once you've exported these photos, so I could click to export the selected photo or photos, and then inside of iTunes, where we can choose, you can select your device and then go to the Photos section and choose which folders you want to synchronize, and you can just enable that folder as one of them. You can also choose to synchronize all photos, but I would generally pick and choose which folders, and that would enable me, in this case, to have a lovely photograph of yarn available to share with everyone on my iPhone. So for those of you that are using Lightroom Classic CC, for example, you can just synchronize a collection and view that synchronized collection via Lightroom Mobile. Very, very easy, but if you're using an older version of Lightroom, it is still possible. Well, not by that method, but by the method I described here. All right. Oh, great question from Carol here. Can you apply more than one preset to an image? Won't subsequent presets change the prior preset? Do I have to make a copy of each change in order to apply additional presets? That all depends on the preset you created. And so let's take a look at that process. Let's switch to a different image. Let's go up to a folder here and let's revisit a shot from Croatia perhaps. And I'm going to apply a number of changes to this image, but let's assume, for example, I'll do this in two pieces. I want to include a conversion to black and white as part of this process, and I also want to include, let's say, a vignette effect to the image. I'll make this real exaggerated just so it's a little easier to see the effect elsewhere. So if I were to save a preset, you might say that by default, you will run into a situation where every photo that you assign the preset to will become black and white with a vignette. But it doesn't have to be that way. If we go over to the Presets section of the left panel in the Develop module, we can click the plus symbol and we can pick and choose what settings will be included. So let's just call this Basic, Black, and White. I'll put that in the Tim Gray Presets folder, and then I can pick and choose. I'm going to select or click on the Check None option, and then I will pick and choose. I want the auto black and white mix, and we want to, let's see, what else are we going to do here? Just the treatment, and I didn't do any of the other changes. I don't believe so. And so where is my, okay, good. Well, actually, I'll turn off auto and we'll leave black and white mix off. So I have a basic black and white, so I'm just using that treatment option. And then I'm going to make another preset. We'll call this Strong Vignette. And I want to turn off treatment. And in this case, I want post-crop vignetting under effects. And I will create. So now, if I go to another image and scroll down to my presets, let's see here, basic black and white right there. So I can convert to black and white. And I can apply a vignette, that strong vignette, as two separate steps. I could also, of course, choose to mix and match others. So the point being is that the preset needs to have only some of the adjustments, not all. If I go choose a preset that has those settings, so in this case vignette and the black and white settings, included as part of the preset, or more to the point, that includes all of the adjustments saved as part of the preset, then it will replace, in this case, the black and white conversion and that strong vignette. All right, as the questions keep piling up here, we'll try and get through as many of these as possible. So Terry asks, the Automask function in targeted adjustments in Lightroom had a poor reputation in earlier versions. Has it improved? Yes and no. So I would say that it's improved in terms of performance, meaning the performance of your computer. It hasn't really gotten significantly better with any of the recent updates when it comes to applying the accuracy of the adjustment, I would say. And so just to illustrate, I'm going to choose an image that'll make this task easy for me. If I go into the Develop module and use the adjustment brush, and now if let's go make sure I have Auto Mask turned on. I do, so the Auto Mask option down below. Now if I paint inside, so let's make sure I have a strong adjustment. I have a very strong exposure adjustment. If I paint inside of this green area, as I drag near the edge, it is not affecting the wall. What I need to do here, assuming I want to adjust only the shutter and none of the rest of the image, I need to keep that crosshair at the center of my brush inside the image, inside the area that I'm trying to adjust, the shutter in this case, and I need to keep the edge of the object, the edge of the shutter, in the circle itself. So I just need to trace along the edge, but keeping that crosshair inside. Once I have a pretty good job, I can turn off Auto Mask and probably reduce my brush size a little bit as well, and then paint inside to clean up, to make sure that mask is as perfect as possible. I've done a reasonably good job here. This area over here, you'll notice when I hover over the pin, the edit pin, that I'm getting an uneven effect for that mask. I'll just turn on the checkbox so I don't have to hover over it. I have an area here that's not quite perfect, and so that would be an indication of an area where it just had a little bit of difficulty, essentially, in terms of tracking the edge of the shutter. So I would say the accuracy is reasonably good in many cases, but not perfect. Certainly, Photoshop does a much better job in terms of being able to create selections, etc., and including Photoshop elements, by the way, for those of you that are not using the full version of Photoshop. All right, let's see. So another question from Terry. Would you recommend checking the Remove Chromatic Aberration checkbox in the lens correction panel for every image? And I would say yes. I have not seen any indication that the removal of chromatic aberration, that feature inside of Lightroom, creates any negative side effects. So in the lens correction section, remove chromatic aberration. I've not seen any indications that that causes any problems in terms of image quality. And so Terry has a follow-up question related to that. If I state that, which I have, if I say that we should turn on remove chromatic aberration for essentially every image, then he suggests that should the panel, the lens correction section there, should that not be at the top of the list here? So lens corrections is pretty far down on the list. We have all these other sections up above. I would say maybe, but more to the point, how about we create a preset that only includes the settings that you want to apply to all images, so for example, lens corrections, and use that as a preset that you assign, a develop module preset or develop settings that you assign at the time that you import all of your photos, so that it just automatically happens for every image. So if there's things that you want to do in terms of develop for all of your images, then I would suggest making a preset that includes only those adjustments and apply that develop preset at the time of importing your photos. And Terry also had a related question that perhaps the same would apply for the process section, the process version that we find down at in the camera calibration section down at the bottom, the very bottom of the right panel in the develop module. And it's a fair point. The process version, this was actually a recent question in the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, and I was answering a question about whether or not I would just automatically upgrade all images to a newer process version. So you can see that this image was optimized in Lightroom using process version number 3 from 2012. Shouldn't I upgrade to version 4? Yes, sort of, except I would say that there is some chance that the appearance of the image will change. And so I wouldn't apply a change to the process version unless I was prepared to then fine-tune the adjustment settings for the image. In general, what that means is I would only upgrade the process version if I was revisiting an image and I wanted to make sure that I got access to the latest adjustments. Because, for example, if I go back to process version number 1, and when I change this, let's notice if the appearance of the image changes much at all. A lot actually. So switch to process version number 1. And now in the basics section, you'll notice that I have fill light and recovery. I do not have highlights and shadows as adjustment options. I could certainly change to the current or the setting that I had used previously, for example. Maybe I would go to the current so that I just have access to everything, and you'll see that the adjustments there in basic then have changed. But again, notice that the image did change in appearance, and so that's why I would not recommend that we apply that kind of in bulk to all our images unless we're also going to be revisiting those adjustments, checking all of our work and fine-tuning, refining as needed. And a quick question I should have addressed right from the start, but hey, why not address it now? John asks if the webinar is being recorded because he's not able to stay for the entire hour. And the answer is yes, of course. As always, we will be recording the presentation, and the recording will be made available. So everyone who is registered will receive an email letting them know how to access that recording. All right, so we have let me read through here quickly, quietly, a long question here. Sluggish performance with an old version, and that's improved with a new computer and with upgrading to the latest version of Lightroom. 2 photo trips came out with thousands of new images. Currently been keeping those images in a separate catalog because it was easier when moving between a laptop and a desktop, but now I'm ready to integrate them. Has anyone experienced an upper performance limit on a Lightroom catalog? At what point should I consider creating a new master catalog? So the core question there is really, essentially, can a Lightroom catalog get to be too big? And I would say, other than the potential for file size on the hard drive operating system limitations, but the short, basic answer is no. I'm at the moment using just a little test catalog, which doesn't contain very many images at all. It is 2,200 images or so. My real Lightroom catalog has nearly 400,000 images, and overall performance, number one, is not bad at all. It has gotten better recently with some recent updates to Lightroom, and Adobe has expressed a commitment to continue focusing on performance in Lightroom, so I'm looking forward to additional updates, hopefully in the near future, that'll improve that performance furthermore. The only thing that I have found consistently to be a challenge as the catalog gets larger is that when you very first launch Lightroom, the list of folders will not be available, essentially. It will look disabled, and the numbers over to the right will not be populated yet. And so for me, with a catalog of nearly 400,000 images, it takes, probably somewhere on the order of a minute or two before that process is completed. Other than that, once I'm actually working in Lightroom, I've not seen any issues with regard to performance that relate to the size of the catalog. In other words, all of the things I complain about from a performance standpoint within Lightroom in general, I see those same issues even when I'm using if I'm using Lightroom for test purposes with a tiny little catalog. So, for example, it was fixed recently, but there used to be a lag when I would switch to the develop module. I would see in the case of the Macintosh, you'd see the pinwheel. That has gone away with the recent update. So any of the issues that I had run into in the past are no longer an issue, I would say. All right, let's take a look here. And next question, how do I make sure my presets stay with catalog? So save presets with catalog, seems not all. Yeah, so George asks about the presets. So when we have presets, they're stored in a folder kind of off in the middle of nowhere, it might seem. And so let's get to our presets tab here in the preferences dialog. There is an option to store the presets with the catalog. And what George is noticing is that he has enabled that, but not all presets are going into that location. And that's because presets that had been previously stored somewhere else are still in that somewhere else place. And so we do have this button here to show the Lightroom presets folder, for example. I'll bring that over onto the correct screen, and I can go inside of that presets folder and see all of the various presets that are saved in that location. So for example, develop presets. If you turn on this checkbox, then those existing presets will still be there. It's only the new stuff. But you can obviously move those files around without any real trouble. Okay. Great question from George regarding the date and time corrections. And so if we were to correct the capture time, if we were updating the metadata to correct for a time zone distinction, for example, we had the camera set to Eastern time zone, but we made a trip to Europe and the clock didn't change on the camera. How do we go about making sure that those changes are reflected? There's two key settings here. In catalog settings, which is specific to the current catalog, that's found on the Lightroom menu on Macintosh, on the edit menu on Windows, we have a metadata tab. First off, I would want to turn on this automatically write changes into XMP. This is a checkbox that I personally always want to have turned on. The only reason it's off here is that this is a demo catalog and I don't want to write changes to the files in that context, but normally this would be turned on. And down at the bottom, in addition to, I first need to turn on the automatically write changes checkbox. Then I also want to have this option to write date or time changes into proprietary RAW files. And that will ensure that not only do things like keywords and star ratings, standard metadata fields get saved out to the images, but also the date and time changes that you might apply will be as well. All right, let's see here. So Ruth asks about traveling using an external hard drive so that she's able to review the photos along the way. And then is there an easy way to re-import them to her desktop computer when she gets home without having to re-import them? The answer is no, not exactly, but it's not a normal import. And so if you're working, let's assume a laptop versus desktop situation. And so while you're traveling with your laptop, you use an external hard drive to store your photos and you've got a catalog. Well, you can get that catalog. What I would recommend in that case is to keep the catalog and the photos on the external hard drive that you're traveling with so that you have easy access to both, because then you can, granted performance will suffer a little bit with the catalog on an external drive, but you can then bring that external hard drive home to your desktop computer, plug it in, and then in your master catalog, so open your master catalog on your desktop, and then go to the File menu and choose the option to import from another catalog. You'll then specify the catalog, which in this case is on your external hard drive. What I typically do is make this a two-step process in that I just leave the photos on the external and then move the photos on the external to the other drive, whatever drive I'm using on my computer to store my photos, just as a precautionary step, essentially. But again, point being is you can just import from another catalog. All right. Let's see, what kind of backlight? What kind of backlight are you using at night in your room when developing your photos? Great question. So what I do personally is try to always work in a dim environment. Obviously, during daylight hours, it's not necessarily possible to actually work in pitch black. I mean, I suppose that it would be on some level possible, but not, generally speaking, if you have got any windows, for example, it's not going to be pitch black. And so I try to make the room as dark as possible. So even during the daytime, I would, close the blinds or the shades and turn off the light, for example. But at night, that becomes more of an issue because now it's pitch black, presumably, or very, very dark if you had the light off. And so you're going to have different conditions with daytime versus nighttime. For me personally, I just like to work in a relatively dim environment. So I have a dimmer switch so that I can tone down the light to a modest level. The key thing is to try to make sure that the display itself that you're looking at, that you're evaluating, number one, should be calibrated and profiled, but also it needs to be ideally the only thing that is, being evaluated with no influence of anything else. And so, in theory, that means we would work in a darkened room with neutral gray walls, etc. So there's no color influence, no light influence. What I think of it as more that I want to make sure that, by and large, the display is the brightest thing in the room, so to speak, and that it's not being, we're not competing with other things. So a big part of that is color influence, and frankly, that's what I'm more concerned about, is that I'm going to get a glare from an incandescent light that will add a yellowish tone to what I'm seeing if it's reflected off my display, or even the surrounding area. It's shocking how easy it is to trick your eyes. And so it's mostly about trying to be as consistent as possible in terms of the overall environment, and also trying to make sure that the display itself is not competing with anything else. All right, so Reed says that, let's see here, so he teaches Lightroom at a variety of college universities and other venues, and spends a great deal of time on image management issues, more so than anything else. And he says that my method of downloading by photo shoot works for professional photographers. Well, maybe not all, but certainly, I hope. But for most of the people that they work with, that Reed works with, downloading by date, year, month, and putting better stuff in collections works better, since folders are only available in the library. So it looks like the question might have gotten cut off there, so I'm not sure what might additionally have been intended there. But my real point, and I try to stress this anytime I'm talking about folder structure, my recommendation is not exactly to define folders based on photo shoots, for example, but rather that you name folders based on the way you think of them. And granted, for me, that does translate into, by and large, shoots or trips. So you'll notice that my folders here, by and large, relate to travel, because most of my photography involves me going somewhere to see something. Or sometimes, of course, at home in New York City, I might photograph as well. Not might, but I certainly photograph when I'm home in New York City. And so that's for me because it makes it easier for me. But the key is being able to find the photos. There is a second piece. So the reason that I recommend naming folders based on the way you think about your images is that then, when it comes time to locate your images, you can just scroll through to whatever it is you're looking for. So if I'm looking for a photo of the Statue of Liberty, I know it's probably going to be in a folder called New York City based on the approach that I take. Part of my problem with the notion of naming folders based on year and month, for example, is that I half the time don't know what year it is today. I don't know what day it is today, etc. And so I don't want to have to try and guess and struggle. I could certainly use keywords, but part of the reason that I want my folder structure to reflect this way of thinking is that the folder structure exists out on the hard drive. That sort of goes above and beyond Lightroom. So even if I stop using Lightroom someday, I will still be able to find my photos just using a browser or using my operating system. So if you happen to be the type of person who does remember dates, and I've met more than a few of them, and I'm very impressed with their capabilities in that regard, then by all means use a date-based folder structure. The other consideration, which Reed alluded to in his question, is that for some people it just doesn't make sense. For example, if you're archiving your family photos so that the rest of the family can access them as well, then granted, maybe nobody can really necessarily locate a folder based on date, but at least then it has a structure that people understand. In other words, if somebody was looking for a picture of a crop duster on my hard drive, they wouldn't necessarily have any clue where to get started. And if I didn't keyword those photos, then it's going to make it even more difficult. They're going to have no hope at all of locating the image. Whereas, for me, it's very easy. Just go to one of my Palouse folders and look, there's a crop duster right from the start. And so that's the whole idea, is being able to find. But I absolutely recognize that in some cases there are different priorities, such as having a structure that's usable by people other than the photographer themselves. Okay. So Doug noticed that my parent folders, so for example, I have an Italy folder here and an Austria folder here. Each of those is a parent that is just being used to consolidate multiple trips to the same place, so multiple trips to Italy in this case. And so my Italy folder shows 0 images because it's empty, and he's noticed that on his system it's showing the total of the folders down below. So if I could do math really quickly, or if I had a calculator handy, I could tell you what that number was going to be, but I have neither of those at my disposal. It shows 0 here, but if we go up to the menu, we can choose from the library, show photos in subfolders, and that will show you the total count. 319, that's exactly what I was going to guess. So 319 photos contained in all of these various subfolders. The reason I don't like this setting is that it makes it look like I have the same images in multiple places. So I go into my Italy folder and I see this image photograph of Marina Piccola from Capri. Then I go to another folder, and probably it's down in this one, yes. Go to another folder, Italy Capri, and I see that exact same image. And my concern is that you might assume, oh, wait, I have the photo in 2 different places, so I can go delete this one. Except it's not in 2 different places, you're just seeing it in 2 different ways. So I don't like that potential confusion, and so I prefer to turn off that show photos in subfolders option, and that's why my count shows 0. All right, let's see here. So now I see that Reed has addressed that collections are available everywhere in Lightroom. So that was, I guess, the piece of the question that I had missed also. And yes, indeed, if you use collections to organize your photos, those collections are available everywhere. So if I go into the Develop module to optimize an image, or if I go into the Slideshow module to make a slideshow, I can still get to those collections, whereas I cannot get to the folders. My only concern about collections is that they are only included in Lightroom. And so if you save metadata out to the images, for example, then you're not going to be able to have those collections included in the metadata. The collections are only in the Lightroom catalog. They're only usable in Lightroom, essentially. So if you go browse your photos with Bridge, you won't see the collections, for example. And so I just have a little bit of concern about, number one, long-term, if later I decide to change my workflow, and short-term if somehow I lost my catalog. And so what I recommend as sort of a workaround for that is that when you would otherwise use a collection, that you assign a keyword that represents that collection. I often refer to these as fake keywords because they're not keywords in the normal context. And so, for example, here, what do I have? Austria stream. Perhaps this was going to be a book about a stream in Austria. I don't know. Really, it was just a demonstration of the collection feature in a previous presentation. But if I have this collection, I would want to assign a keyword. If it was for, let's say, a book project, then I would assign a keyword like book-Austrian stream or something like that. And then I might even not use a normal collection. I would use a smart collection based on that keyword. So when we create a collection, it can be a smart collection. And so I can say I want to include in this collection images that meet all of the following rules, a star rating of such and such, and I can also choose a keyword as part of that. So I can go into my other metadata, keywords, contains, and let's just say water, for example. I don't even know if any of these images have keywords at all. So let's go ahead and take a look. Oh, and yes, indeed, I do have some images that have the keyword water assigned. And so that smart collection automatically reflects that. So I could use a sort of project-based keyword, for example, to work around that issue. Okay. Let me see. Mostly in Lightroom. So let's see, a couple things here. Can you review how to merge 2 catalogs? That was sort of addressed in the context of that traveling workflow. So if you recall that we can choose File and then import from another catalog and then navigate to the location where that catalog is stored. So let's say I was going to import from this catalog, for example, which I'll have to cancel shortly because it's a big, huge catalog. But I could then import from that other catalog I think this is the only Lightroom catalog that I actually have available at the moment. But in any event, I could then adjust the settings for that import. So I'm really not exactly merging per se. I'm importing the photos from a different catalog. All right, next, let's see here from Sunny. So he's asking, when his computer hard drive was starting to fill up, he moved his Lightroom photos from 2013 and 2014 to an external hard drive, and he did that outside of Lightroom. And now when he sees the images, they're not showing up properly in Lightroom. How can I get them into the catalog with the develop history? If the images are already in the catalog, then you can simply find the missing folder. And so you could choose one of those images, for example, one of the folders rather, that is missing. So if you, outside of Lightroom, moved a folder from one location to the other, in the old location you would see a question mark indicating that that folder is missing. You could then reconnect the missing folder. So for example, let's see here, I'm going to reveal this in Finder, and if I were to rename, so I'll just rename this to, trip to Croatia, for example. Let's pretend like I had moved it as opposed to just renaming it. I'll see a missing folder indication. I can right click and choose Find Missing Folder, and then navigate out to the location on my hard drive where that is stored, and then click Choose, and the folder then is updated accordingly. And in that context, I would retain all of my settings. If the images are not actually in Lightroom, then the only real option would be to synchronize. So I could right click on a folder and choose to synchronize that folder. In this case, I have another folder that you're not seeing in my Lightroom catalog that is actually out on my hard drive. And so if I right click on an existing folder and choose to synchronize, Lightroom will go look, and in this case there's 99 images. I'll go ahead and choose to synchronize so that that folder, in this case that's an Italy 2017 folder, will be essentially imported automatically. But in that case, if I did not save the metadata out to the actual image files, remember that setting in Catalog Settings on the Metadata tab, if I don't have that option enabled, then the metadata will not be brought in because it's not there. Of course, capture metadata will be there, but anything I did in Lightroom in that context will have been lost. And so, good question. Marilyn asks if she imports a RAW file into Lightroom that already has a sidecar file, in other words, it had been processed in Camera Raw, the settings are imported. That was a question, correct? And that is correct, yes indeed. If you have photos out on your hard drive that you processed in Camera Raw, there will be from Camera Raw, at least by default, as long as you're saving with the file itself, those settings, you'll have that XMP sidecar file. So things like star ratings and your adjustments from Adobe Camera Raw, your develop adjustments as it were, will be imported into Lightroom. So then, if you make changes inside Lightroom, but do not have the right changes to XMP checkbox that I referenced a couple times today, if that is not turned on, will that cause the photos to show up with a metadata mismatch? And the answer is yes, but not exactly in the same way. I'll show you exactly what I mean here. So if I go to a folder here and select an image and go to the metadata section over on the right panel, presumably, no, that one's up to date. So let's go find an image that had been updated. Let's see, those are JPEGs, so that won't be the case. I know that there will be some here that are not up to date, but I'm not finding them. But we'll pretend. If I don't find this soon, actually, was it these images, perhaps, that have the metadata has been changed? There we go. Woo, finally I found one just as I was about to give up. So the metadata has been changed for this image, and essentially keep in mind a metadata mismatch represents a situation where you either made a change in Lightroom that is not reflected out on your hard drive, or you made a change out on your hard drive that is not reflected in Lightroom. And so when we click the button over to the right of that indication for the metadata status, we can then choose to save so that the changes will be reflected and will be back up to date. Not a critical factor, but point being is that, yes, there will be a mismatch, but in that context, it's not one that you need to worry about. But again, I do recommend having that checkbox turned on in catalog settings, in part so that other applications will be able to see the metadata in case you need to browse. Just don't make any changes outside of Lightroom. Good question. Another question from Marilyn. So on the computer, Lightroom leaves imported photos wherever they are, assuming you use the Add option. And so if I import from my hard drive and use the Add option in the import dialog as opposed to copy, then those photos remain where they are. Does Lightroom do the same thing? Yes, in terms of leaving the photo there temporarily. So if in Lightroom Mobile I import a photo from the camera roll, the photo is still in the camera roll. And in fact, yes, I can delete the photo from the camera roll, because while it's left there, it has been copied into Lightroom, and then Lightroom Mobile will synchronize. In fact, I have some images here where that had been the case. So from my iPhone, I imported into Lightroom Mobile a photo, a brilliant, wonderful photo of a keyboard here that was synchronized via my phone in this case. I obviously have some photos from the iPad mini as well. And so those actually then get copied to a separate folder structure, which means that yes, you can delete the photos from your iPhone, for example, after you've imported them into Lightroom Mobile. That said, do not delete from Lightroom Mobile unless you really want that photo to disappear from absolutely everywhere, because it will be, the change will be synchronized. You'll lose everything. So Randy asks about the synchronization. When I synchronize a folder, it's going to the import screen. I did not. There is a setting in Preferences, and I believe it's under... No, now I'm going to forget where it is. Let's see. Show import dialog when a memory card is... No, that's not the one. Show current previous. So right here, the current previous collection during import. That's what controls whether or not you go to that previous import collection when you perform that import. And let's see, once you put pictures in the Instagram folder and share them, do you delete them? Good question from Al. Once you put pictures in your Instagram share folder and share them, do you delete them from your hard drive? I guess that's only tangentially a Lightroom question. But the short answer is no, I don't, because what I do actually to post to Instagram, as I mentioned, I use an export to a folder and I synchronize that folder to my phone. And part of the reason that I leave them in that folder is so that they will continue synchronizing and updating to my phone. And part of the reason that I want that collection sort of permanently on my phone is that even when I don't have an internet connection, I can show off my Instagram photos, which theoretically at least are some of my better images. At least they're my favorite images for one reason or another. Let's see here. So Abby asks about targeted adjustments. And so let's find a different image here just for fun. Here's a blur. Let's go with the wavy blur. If I'm in the develop module and I'm working with a targeted adjustment, can I still get to the other adjustments? So here I'll just paint a stripe across the image. I'll turn off the overlay. You can see that's just a darkening of the exposure with my targeted adjustment. So underneath the adjustment brush, I have a negative value, a strong one set for exposure, paint across the image, and I get an exposure adjustment just in that area. But then are all these other adjustments, so she asked specifically about HSL, for example, available? Yes. But let's do a green desaturate. Let's go yellow, actually, probably more effective. The yellow desaturation, for example, whatever other adjustment you go find, will affect the entire image. So these other adjustments are still available when you're working with a targeted adjustment, but for targeted adjustments, only these settings that you see on the pop-up that appears when you choose one of those targeted adjustment tools, the gradient filter, or the graduated filter, I should say, the elliptical, now I'm losing the name of it, but in any event, or the adjustment brush, any of those three targeted adjustments enable you to work only with these specific adjustments that are listed on the pop-up that appears. When you click Done, for example, those adjustments disappear. So yes, all of these adjustments down below are available when you're working on a targeted adjustment, but they are global adjustments. The targeted adjustments are only those up above. Okay. So the preset, a camera preset that imports from, a preset, I should say, that you apply during import. So a question from Richard, how do you deal with different lenses on the same camera? Well, actually, that is an automatic setting. What I like to do is down in the lens correction section, I will go to enable profile and turn on chromatic aberration and choose auto. But this is actually always auto if we save a preset. So I'll go over here on the left panel and create a preset, and I'm going to include, whichever adjustments I actually want. But so for example, correcting for profile-based corrections and chromatic aberrations, I could turn off the other adjustments here other than process version. So if I save this as a preset, when I apply this preset to any image, it will be automatic based on the metadata for the image. So it's actually an issue you don't need to worry about at all. And then Harold asks a question regarding panoramas. When he assembles them in Lightroom, it's no problem. So this is actually more of a Photoshop question, I suppose. But when he assembles panoramas in Lightroom, they come together without any problems at all. In Photoshop, the edges are looking fuzzy. It sounds to me like he's using the option for applying content-aware fill to transparent areas. So when you create a panorama, there's often some areas of transparency, some areas without any pixels around the edges, because the photos have to be warped and transformed to make them come together. And so I'm assuming that it's that issue, and if you turn off that content-aware option, that'll take care of it. Okay, so... so Tom asks a question related to the new Lightroom CC. This has been a point of confusion, understandably, for many photographers. Essentially, he has an Adobe Creative Cloud account, of course, and a subscription, and he's already installed Lightroom Classic CC, does not want to use the new cloud version of Lightroom, but the app, whenever he runs the app, it tells me that he has updates to install, and so it's trying to get him to install Lightroom CC, the cloud-based version of Lightroom. And essentially, he doesn't want to be told about that version. Is there a way to essentially just get rid of it altogether? Unfortunately, there's not a way to get Adobe. He's basically saying he doesn't want Adobe to keep bugging him about Lightroom CC. And unfortunately, there's not a way, at least not at present. So the key would be just to not install Lightroom CC, but recognizing that can be confusing because we're using Lightroom, what we would normally have thought of as Lightroom CC, but now the brand new version of Lightroom is instead being called Lightroom CC. And so a bit of confusion, but no, the only option there is to just simply not install the new Lightroom CC, but continue updating Lightroom Classic. So Peter asks if I print from Lightroom or if I use Photoshop or Photoshop Elements. And what I would say is that, yes, as a general rule, when I'm printing an image, I do so from Photoshop. If it's an image I really care about, part of that is because I want to exercise control over sharpening. Even though sharpening inside of Lightroom in the print module is very, very good, it doesn't give me the control that I actually want to be able to exercise. And so I print from Photoshop. I would send the image over to Photoshop from Lightroom, resize it, and whatever else I need to do, sharpen it, etc., to get it ready for print. In terms of Lightroom, the key is just to select the image or have an image available on the film strip. I can choose to print selected photos versus all film strip photos. Choose a template over on the left side. So maybe I want to print an 8x10 or a 5x7. And then I can check all of those settings. Generally, the zoom to fill option I do not want to use because that will crop the image depending on the aspect ratio of the cell that I'm using to print. Rotate to fit I would generally turn on. The rest of this is related to primarily the print layout. So most of that I don't need to worry about. Some personalized settings. Do I want to watermark, for example? And then printing to the printer, making sure that we're not in draft mode. Resolution, I generally use 360 ppi for inkjet printers, although it will vary depending on the specific model in terms of how it's rendering internally. Sharpening based on low standard or high, typically standard, but you'll want to do some testing on your own. And then glossy versus matte because the output is different. And then make a print based on the profile that you're using. So whatever, I have several papers here. Let's see, I have the Red River Aurora Fine Art paper here, for example. If I was printing to that, I generally use perceptual as my rendering intent as opposed to the relative colorimetric. But it varies depending, and this has changed with different profiles over the years. Relative colorimetric in theory I would prefer, but I found more recently that a lot of the newer profiles are giving me better results with perceptual. And then send it to the printer, making sure that color management is turned off there. But again, generally speaking, my preference is still to print from Photoshop, in large part, in fairness, just based on the ability to better control sharpening. Let's see, so I've got, we're a little bit over time, but I'll take a couple more questions here. Let's see, Saul is switching from a Drobo storage drive to a Synology drive, about 80,000 images that will need to be transferred. The Lightroom library will therefore have 80,000 missing images. Not necessarily. So in Lightroom, you can actually create a new folder. So let's pretend that, well, actually what I'll do just to simulate this is remove that Instagram folder, and then once that folder is gone, the photos will remain on the hard drive, by the way, when you remove a folder like that. If I want to be able to move all of these images from one location to another, I could select all of those folders, for example, and drag and drop, but where am I going to drop to? So if this were my Drobo drive and I've got a Synology drive, how do I gain access to it? The simple solution is to create a new folder. So over toward the right of the folders heading, I'll click plus and choose add folder. And then, let's just go into the pictures folder and we'll call this new drive. Well, I'll just call this photos actually. So I'll call that photos and choose that. And now that photos folder, which is empty, appears. So in this context, you'd be making that photos folder on the Synology drive, and then you can select all of your folders and drag and drop them to the new location. That will enable you to move, as we saw earlier today, from one location to another. Just bear in mind, of course, that when we're moving, there's a slight risk, so just make sure you have a good backup, recognizing, of course, that the Drobo does its own backup by default. Let's see, in terms of RAID, I should say. And try and get a couple more of these before we break for today. Looks like we'll have to have another Q&A session, and I will try to get some of these addressed in upcoming Ask Tim Gray emails as well, if the questions that I've missed, which I know will be more than a few here, actually, as it turns out. Let's see. How do I set up preferences? Don't want to lose my backups in my drive. So Carol has her photos backed up on external hard drives. She's using GoodSync for that. With the purchase of a new camera, had to migrate to the new Lightroom Classic CC. Don't want to abandon the backups and the drives and use the cloud. How do I set up my preferences to do this? So actually, assuming we're talking about Lightroom Classic, then there's really, it's a non-issue. You would just use the location wherever those images are stored. You would just bring those into Lightroom. You could import them all at once as one big process, and so that would be easy. If you're not going to use the cloud, then Lightroom CC is not an option, because the new Lightroom CC will always synchronize to the cloud, I suppose, unless you're not connected to the internet, but that would sort of defeat the purpose. So you don't have to abandon the backups at all. You'd be able to use the same hard drives, the same backup system, etc. You would just be importing initially into Lightroom Classic. If you've been using Lightroom in the past, you would just open your old catalog in the new version of Lightroom and it'll update that for you. But if you've not been using Lightroom, then it would just be a wholesale import. And then, let's see. So let me get one more question that was submitted here. Actually, Janet asked if there's an Instagram Publish plugin within Lightroom. No, and to my knowledge, there is not one available. If somebody knows that there is one, let me know, please. Or obviously I could Google that, but if you happen to know, let me know. There are other services. So, for example, SmugMug you can install here in Publish Services, Facebook, etc. But for Instagram, to my knowledge, unless somebody's made a new one, that is not an option that's currently available. Yeah, and Reed points out, I talked earlier about the add option when importing, and he points out that if you're importing from a removable media card, so like a media card from your camera, that the add option is disabled. That is true, and thank goodness, because you certainly would not want to use the add option if it was a removable media card that you're eventually going to reformat. All right, so when doing a target adjustment, how do you initialize the settings? So in the develop module, we had looked earlier at the ability to apply a targeted adjustment. What I personally do is inside of the settings here, if I establish the adjustment that I want to use, let's pretend like I wanted to use a brightness adjustment rather than a darkness adjustment, that becomes the default. So I can just switch to another image and that becomes the default. So if I use a negative value, for example, then that will carry through. So I just use a simple approach of applying a very strong adjustment initially. So again, let's assume that I was auto-masking and I just wanted to apply an adjustment to the sun, and then I crash Lightroom, which has never, ever, ever happened before. I guess this is my punishment for going overtime on the webinar. So we will come right back to that. Give me just a moment here to get Lightroom up and running again. Here we are. All right, so if I'm in the develop module and now working on a completely different image and working with a targeted adjustment, again, with that Automask option turned on, I would generally use an exaggerated exposure adjustment so that I can see very clearly where I'm painting. Now, the other option would be to turn on the Show Selected Mask overlay, but I find that this just isn't as easy to see for me personally as compared to a strong exposure adjustment. Oh, and a couple people are pointing out, thank you very much, Sam and Reed. We'll ignore the fact that Lightroom crashed on me. So lrinstagram.com has an Instagram plugin for Lightroom, which I did not know about until right this very moment. So thank you guys both, Sam and Reed. Probably some others in here as well that I haven't seen yet, but thanks very much for letting me know about that. So yes, there is an Instagram plugin for Lightroom, I'm happy to tell you, and it is at lrinstagram.com. With that, now that I've learned something from all of you, from some of you, and hopefully you've learned plenty from me here today as well, I want to thank all of you for joining me today for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. And before I close out, I do want to once again thank Tamron for sponsoring today's presentation. And so, there we go, our closing slide. So thank you very much to Tamron for sponsoring the GreyLearning webinar series, making this series of presentations possible. Thank you to all of you for joining me today. I hope it's been a helpful experience. I will grab all of these questions and address some of those in upcoming Ask Tim Grey emails, and it looks like it would be time well spent to have another Q&A session on Lightroom, so do keep an eye on your email inboxes or the Ask Tim Grey email newsletter for info on when we'll have another such session. And note that you can visit timgrey.me/MLR99 for a discount on the Mastering Lightroom bundle of video training courses so you can learn even more, including the Lightroom Quick Tips course, which gives you a brand new quick tip each and every single week. I think we're up to, several dozen, maybe, I think it's been about a year's worth of lessons now that are included and more being added, a new one being added each week. So thank you once again for joining me, and I'll look forward to having you join me for a future presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series sponsored by Tamron. Thanks very much.